Late one night, Robert Moorman lay in his hotel bed looking at the ceiling. He was troubled. His mother, who was supposed to spend the past 72 hours with him before he went back to prison, wasn't there. All of her belongings were scattered around the room. Some of her clothing was in the closet, and her toothbrush was still in the bathroom. But that was it. As he lay there thinking about her, he noticed that the room was beginning to stink. And looking over at the bag of rotting meat on the dresser, he knew that he needed to get rid of it soon. Today's story has many twists and turns, so I will do my best to try to make it as easy as possible to follow along. I hope you enjoy this story so much that you will like, subscribe, and toss a comment down below to let me know. And if you find the secret in the background, let me know the timestamp in the comments and I will pin the first correct answer. Okay? Let's go. On January 12, 1984, Robert Moorman sat sort of hunched over in his bed inside his jail cell, waiting for the guards. As he sat there looking around this cold, hard room, he thought about what had landed him there 7 years ago. He thought about the time he accidentally shot and injured his mother, and the time he set his mother's house on fire. But those times, he had been able to avoid being arrested and charged with anything, and this was only because his mother was able to talk the police out of it. Then there was the time when he was 16. The police were called to the Moorman house because he had used rope to tie up an 8-year-old girl. Robert was able to talk his own way out of it that time when he told the police that they were just playing cowboys and Indians. And although not politically correct today, this was a popular game amongst children in the past. And then finally, his mind drifted over to 8-year-old Shelley Mickelson. She was why he was in that cell. He thought about how he had driven up to Marshall Elementary School in Flagstaff, Arizona that day back in 1972 and told the 4th grader that he was there to take her for lunch. He simply rolled the car window down. He lied and told her that her mother was okay with them going for lunch. And with that, Shelley hopped into the car. And together, 23-year-old Robert Moorman and Shelley Mickelson drove away, successfully completing Robert's plan to kidnap Shelley. Robert had been receiving treatment for an intellectual disability and lived with his mother only a few blocks away from Shelley's house, and so as eyewitnesses started identifying Shelley and Robert's car, the mystery of who took Shelley wasn't a mystery for very long, and very quickly, Robert and his car were all over the news. Robert sat there on his bed and thought about how his car had broken down on the side of the highway that day, and how a nice couple in an RV, the Swansons, had picked him and Shelley up so that they didn't freeze to death on that cold January day. He couldn't decide if the Swansons were his salvation or his undoing because it was during the ride with them that Mrs. Swanson convinced him to turn himself in. And so, soon after that, Robert Moorman walked into the Las Vegas police station with Shelley right beside him, placed his handgun and a pair of handcuffs on the desk in front of the desk sergeant, and told them that he was who they were looking for. During questioning after Shelley's kidnapping, Robert had denied assaulting the young girl in any way, claiming he had blacked out and couldn't remember anything that had happened. But Shelley told a different story, stating that Robert did do things that he should not have. However, Robert did admit that he fully intended to kill Shelley, as well as the Swansons, but he later decided not to because they were nice to him. As Robert sat there reflecting on all of these events that had led to this moment, the guard finally arrived at his cell where he pulled the keys out of his pocket, fumbled around with them until he found the right one, unlocked Robert's cell, and opened it. Robert was not eligible for parole because he had previously been paroled, but he ended up violating the terms and found himself back behind bars. However, that didn't mean that he would never be able to leave the prison. Robert was part of a program called Compassionate Leave, where he was able to leave the prison for 72 hours, and today was the day he was allowed to pass through the prison gate and then walk to the Blue Mist Motel just a quarter of a mile west of the prison, where he would meet his mother, Maud Moorman, in room 22. It was a small mid-century motel that was known for its bright blue paint. There was no missing it because it looked like it was something straight out of an old movie. with the motel doors opening directly to the parked cars and a gated outdoor pool. And that day, Robert arrived, checking into his room, and then spent a quiet evening with his mother. Bright and early the next morning, Robert quietly got up and, careful not to wake his mom, he left room 22 and then walked to a nearby convenience store where he purchased some food, a folding buck knife and a steak knife. When Robert got back to the Blue Mist Motel, he decided he needed to make a quick stop by the office to have a quick word with Mr. Patel, the owner. He just wanted to let them know that there was no need for housekeeping to come by and clean his room that day because his mom wasn't really feeling very well, so Robert didn't want her to be disturbed. And while Robert was talking to Mr. Patel, he suddenly asked for some disinfectant spray. Mr. Patel kind of looked like Robert, like this was a strange request. And Robert, seeing the look on Mr. Patel's face, quickly said that the room had a bad smell and he wanted to try to remove it. It was then that Mrs. Patel, who was standing nearby, actually noticed that Robert himself had a putrid smell coming off of his clothes. But, not thinking any more of it, she handed Robert a spray bottle, and then everyone went on with their day. Later that morning, Mrs. Patel was cleaning the adjacent rooms when she noticed that Robert had dropped several dirty towels outside his door. And so she went over and picked up the towels with the intention of putting them in the laundry. But when she picked them up, she immediately held them as far away from her as her arm would allow because these towels smelled horrid. There was absolutely no way this smell was coming out of this fabric. So she just tossed the towels in the trash rather than trying to wash them. She had no idea what that smell was, but man, it was horrendous. Later that afternoon, a friend of Robert's mother stopped by the hotel looking for her. Marianne Southworth lived in Florence and visited Robert's mother every time she came down to see her son. But this time, when she knocked on the door of room 22 and Robert answered, he only partially opened the door and stood between the door and the door frame, sort of like he was trying to block the view inside with his body. He seen Marianne standing there and then proceeded to tell her that his mother had actually just gone for lunch. She had actually just missed her, and he wasn't really sure where she went for lunch. And while he was talking, even though Robert was blocking the view inside as best he could, Marianne did manage to catch a quick peek inside and notice that Maud's purse was clearly visible on the table in the room. She also noticed that despite the cold January afternoon, the air conditioner in Robert's room was on full blast. With no other option available to her, Marianne eventually gave up trying to visit with her friend that day and turned around and left, thinking about how odd this encounter was. That afternoon, Robert decided to clean up room 22 a little bit and asked Mr. Patel if the dumpster behind the motel would be picked up in the morning, explaining that his mom had brought some meat with her but it had spoiled and he needed to get rid of it. Mr. Patel gave Robert another strange look and let him know that the dumpster would be emptied in 3 days, which would be Monday. Unsatisfied with this schedule, Robert asked the owners of the local pizza parlor and the nearby liquor store if he could use their dumpster to get rid of some cow guts. For some reason, a friend of his gave him these cow guts, and Robert had no use for them, so he was looking for a dumpster so he could get rid of them. It was an odd request, to say the least, and both business owners refused to allow this. The pizza parlor owner in particular found this strange. He had worked in the prison and was familiar with Robert, and he could tell that Robert looked very nervous and worried. He knew deep down in his gut that there was something wrong. And so, acting on his gut instinct, he called the Florence police, who checked in on Robert at 10:30 p.m. that night. The officers pulled up to the Blue Mist Motel, exited their vehicles and walked up to the room and then knocked on door number 22. Wearing only a pair of unzipped pants and a belt, Robert answered the door. And there the officers told Robert that they had just stopped by to check in on his mom because they heard that she wasn't feeling very well. And upon hearing this, Robert explained to them that his mother had left. She left around 6 p.m. that evening with a Mexican woman, and he didn't know where she was, telling them, "I'm getting worried about her because she didn't take her medication with her." The officers just stood there a little bit stunned with what they had just been told. They looked at one another, and then one of the officers said to Robert, "Why are you trying to get rid of cow guts?" And Robert simply replied, saying, "A friend gave them to me, but I got rid of them. I just flushed them down the toilet." Nothing actually looked out of the ordinary, but the officers felt he was hiding something. They then left and drove to the prison to ask the guards for a description of Miss Moorman. Late that night, Robert lay in his bed, looking at the ceiling. He was troubled. He really needed to get rid of that meat that his mother had brought with her. It was stinking up the place. He lay there thinking of ways he could get rid of it when suddenly he got an idea. Robert quickly sat up in bed and grabbed the phone and then proceeded to call the prison. And when the call went through, he spoke to a guard he knew. He said to the guard that he had 25 pounds of dog bones that he thought that maybe the prison's guard dogs would like to chew on. The prison guard thought this was really strange, but he agreed to help him. The prison guard arrived at the motel a few minutes later with his truck. Together they loaded up the box of bones and then he drove back to the prison. And not long after the guard arrived back at the prison, he received a phone call from the officers that had spoken to Robert earlier that evening. When they mentioned that Robert's mother was missing and Robert had been acting suspiciously, the guard's mind suddenly drifted over to the box of bones that he had just picked up. And as the potential of what they may be slowly settled upon him, he informed the police of what had just happened. When the officers arrived at the prison and opened up the box, they found trash bags filled with bones. But the officers thought that these bones were not the right size to be dog bones. The officers believed that they were human bones, and so they took the box that was filled with the bones and drove to the hospital where doctors would be able to determine if they were human or not. In the meantime, the officers drove back to the motel to find Robert. They told him that they just wanted to wait there with him until his mother arrived home because they were getting concerned for her safety, since Robert had told them she didn't have her medication, and they suggested that he wait with them in their squad car. The three of them sat in the car for over an hour until two officers from the prison arrived and parked next to them. The results had come back from the hospital, and the bones were, indeed, human, and with that, Robert was handcuffed. When police entered room 22 at the Blue Mist Motel, the bath towels, the bedding, bathroom walls, tub, and bathroom floor were all covered in blood, and there was human tissue found on the knives Robert had purchased from the convenience store days earlier, as well as on some cleaning rags. Bizarrely, they also found his mother's bra hanging in the closet with $500 in cash pinned to it. And in the dumpster behind the motel, police found Maud Moorman's head, her torso that had been cut into two pieces, her feet, and her hands, minus their fingers. Each of these body parts were wrapped in plastic bags. In Robert's belongings in his prison cell, they found a notebook with strange entries in it, such as instructions on how to train a dog to make bank deposits. They also found a document entitled The Last Will and Testament. Maud Moorman had already written a will that left everything to Robert, but her assets, totaling approximately $200,000, were to be put into a trust in his name, and he would only have access to the interest it created. She did not believe he was mentally capable to handle that much money all at once. But Robert disagreed with this and had written his own amendment to the will. His amendment would put the assets into a company called RHM Enterprises. The problem was that RHM Enterprises did not exist and his mother had not signed the will. The amendment was dated January 13th, the same day he murdered his mother. Robert claimed that his mother had forced herself on him ever since he was a child. He explained that they were sleeping together in room 22 when he put a pillow over her face and suffocated her. But a post-mortem examination of what was left of Maud's body showed no signs of sexual activity, and none of Robert's body fluids were ever found anywhere. At the trial, his lawyers again claimed that Robert didn't know what he was doing and was mentally unable to understand the severity of his crimes. However, the jury completely disagreed, and Robert was convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death on May 7th, 1985. For the next 37 years, Robert sat on death row waiting for his execution, and despite several appeals, he was finally scheduled for lethal injection with only 2 days' notice. So, on February 29th, 2012, Robert Moorman requested a double hamburger, French fries, 2 beef burritos, 2 14-ounce containers of Rocky Road ice cream, and 3 RC Colas before his lethal dose of pentobarbital. And in a strange twist, because one of the drugs used for the execution at the time had expired, his execution actually only used a single drug rather than the standard 3-drug cocktail. His last words were an apology directed at the family of Shelley Mickelson, saying, "I hope this brings closure and they could start healing now. I just hope they will forgive me in time." So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Thank you for watching, and if you haven't already, please make sure to like, subscribe, and toss a comment below. Let me know what you think, because I'd love to find out. And I will see you again later.